The following is brought to you by GFL Ag. Next thing you know the next thing. Next is Now is a short podcast discussing agriculture's emerging next-gen tech and trends as they're happening in our industry. Next is Now, presented by GFL Ag. Listen where you get your podcasts today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. Great to see everyone joining us. So keen in the comments. We've already got some great comments and suggestions that are coming in for things we're definitely going to talk about tonight. One of them will not be if Rush will be our next intro music. A, can't afford the royalties, and B, ew. All right, so did want to just quickly touch on that tonight does qualify as a knowledge sharing event. And so we will share that email later in the program. And as always, if you collect those CEU credits, we give those out too for watching the program. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. Let us know you watch the show and we'll get you all lined up with those. Okay, without further ado, tonight we are talking about split application nitrogen on wheat, but we're talking about wheat fertility in general. So get those questions queued up. And I am absolutely pleased to bring in my guest to have this conversation. We have Brian Beres with AAFC Lethbridge and Phil Needham with Needham Ag Technologies out of Kentucky. Welcome here, gents.
Hey, Lindsay.
Hello, Phil. Hello, Brian. We have some great comments and questions already that we probably need to get to. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so but before we do, let's just quickly catch everybody up to speed on our guest tonight. So, Phil, we'll start with you. Tell us a bit about Needham Ag Technologies, what you do in Kentucky, for those who don't know.
So we're enjoying the warm weather, Lindsay. It was 27 Celsius today, which is rather warm for the 1st of April, and we're really dry too. Brian's obviously from Lethbridge, so he knows what dry weather's all about, but we're surprisingly dry for this area. Some guys are planting corn, planting beans, and I help growers mainly with wheat management. So that's a little about what I do and what we're seeing here, okay?
All right. Sounds kind of similar to here. We're just a few weeks behind you. Brian, and I'm glad someone has already mentioned it. I would imagine that you have put in just a million ultra early seeding trials already. I mean, I might be exaggerating, but maybe not.
Well, I mean, it was one of those years again where we almost were able to go in that warm spell in January before that really cold snap hit. But we did get in and registered because we start at 0. That's our protocol. And then we're telling growers anything over 0 degrees in the top 2 inches, you're good to plant wheat. And we got the 0 and the 2 degrees in, the guys did. And then the next day we got the snow and the cold and more snow. And today was 17, 18. So and I see there's lots of pictures nearby of and in Saskatchewan and even parts of Manitoba where it's dry, where there's been interest in it, right? And guys are, I think, are a bit more empowered to go and try it.
So, and I mean, we could do a whole show about ultra early seeding, and we will. Let's mark it down for like later this year. But certainly, if there are questions, and I see there's one already, we can tackle some of those as well. If we've got you on the show, we're definitely going to do that. But just quickly from the research that you're doing, like you have many years of data to back up that, like if it's 2 degrees in February, if the soil is 2 degrees in February, it's dry, you should go.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think my original proposal I conceptualized and submitted in around like 2013 or something like that. We got rolling. So it's been around a decade, 45 site years of data now. And the only real train wreck was once on our land, actually, where they say, oh, you guys in Southern Alberta can plant whatever. But it was the soil was still a little bit too tight at 0 degrees. And I'm using Conservapack openers, like narrow knife openers, and we ripped up some pretty good aggregates. So that was an issue. But otherwise, yeah, it's been good.
Okay. All right. Keep that in mind, everybody. And we can talk about fertility management on that as well. Phil, we've got some some comments in here, and we were talking just before we went to air that it does feel, that we are a couple weeks ahead of perhaps the average. Some are sharing, that some spring crops went in, even in Manitoba. I know barley went in here not that long ago. So, Phil, for the wheat crop in Kentucky, anyway, are you looking? Is it also looking a few weeks ahead?
Yeah, I would say most of the growers in Kentucky, and I would say within multiple states around Kentucky, we're 1 to 2 weeks ahead of normal from a point of view of physiological growth stage to calendar date. So the wheat is much bigger. We did have a spring freeze 10 days ago, approximately, when it got down really cold on jointed wheat. We hope we don't have any more because we expected some damage out of that, but we didn't. But we don't need any more spring freezes, okay? After the jointing stage. Oh, it's all jointed, okay? We don't need any very cold weather. It's supposed to get down to 2 Celsius, I think, in a few days, but that's as cold as I've seen in the forecast.
Okay, so that is a few things, and welcome. Matthew's joining us from New Zealand. Welcome here, Matthew, from the future. How was it there? So thanks for joining us for sure. So a few things. Warren did share just before we went to air. He sent a picture. Was walking 100-acre of wheat, and the geese got to it. Brian, you had a great term for the geese. What do you call Canada geese?
Did you want me to add the swear word salty language or just call
No,
them
actually, no,
okay.
just the PG version, if you will.
Sky rats? Sky rats. My
Sky
buddy
rat.
Vance, who hunts a lot and
Yeah.
shoots a lot of geese, he calls them sky rats. So
Yeah.
that's where I got that from. So shout out to
Yeah.
Vance.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so I'll put this to you, Phil. This is a winter wheat crop. But Brian, I'm sure you've dealt with Canada geese eating wheat crops and seedlings as well. Phil, if you see bird damage just after green up and it looks awful, is it as bad as it looks? Because Warren sent me the picture and it looks pretty terrible.
So we sometimes have geese in some of the river bottoms close to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in Kentucky. And if in high densities, high populations, I mean, they'll just mow it off. I mean, the ground is bare. So, the guys that have them know they're out there generally, and they're out there at least firing some shots at them, skewing them away. But they can do a lot of damage in high populations for sure. I mean, they can mow off 10 or 20 acres in a field in which there's almost nothing but weeds at harvest time. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Brian, what do you guys do for the cobra chickens? That's what I call them, Kevin. I also call them cobra chickens. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you have the scare cannons and stuff like that. And normally we've been fairly lucky that way where we are. Normally what we're doing is we're fending off birds later in the year, especially if we're running corn trials or something like that. That can be a real gong show around here. But normally the geese have not taken too many liberties with us yet.
Mm-hmm. You're lucky. That's and Warren, I don't live that far from Warren. Warren's closer though to water, of course, to a very large river, the St. Lawrence River. And I would agree they probably never leave. And so they can really do a number. It's pretty nasty. Okay, so but for those of you who still have wheat, and I'm sure Warren still has some wheat fields, we are going to talk split application and for a couple different reasons. Of course, yield being a huge driver, but when we talk in the West as well, we do want to talk about protein. And yes, Dave, we are going to talk, Dave Hooker, yes, we are going to talk about wheat fertility. So let's maybe start there. We are going to talk about split application on and look at it from a couple different angles. And so get your questions in early. We're going to tackle this as well. Phil, do you think we should start? You did share, you've got a clip from a couple weeks ago of what you're looking at and some of the visual symptomology. Do you want to start there and give us something visual to work with?
Yeah, why don't you start with that, and then we can give some comments after the video.
Yes. Okay. So let's do that. Producer Jay, if you would, let's share what Phil sent in. This is from, I think, March 21st-ish. Right? Yeah, about 10 days ago.
It's the 18th of March 2024.
and we're standing in one of our randomly replicated wheat into no-till corn stalks management trial. And what we got here is wheat no-tilled into high-yielding corn residue, around 200 bushel per acre corn, and we no-tilled wheat straight into it. And this particular study right here is comparing different rates and timings of nitrogen in this system. And it's important to note that obviously we're no-tilling the wheat at an angle to the corn stalks. We recommend doing that. But the corn was no-tilled into soybeans, and the soybean residue is still here. And then the beans were no-tilled into wheat residue, high-yielding wheat residue, or high-yielding wheat. So there's a tremendous amount of residue on the soil surface. So there's a huge carbon penalty, and it shows in this treatment 101 that had 0 spring applied nitrogen. And it shows it's small, it's yellow, it's stunted, visually nitrogen deficient. Looking at the bottom leaves, classic nitrogen deficiency. So that's 101, no spring nitrogen. 102, and again, this is a replicated trial, randomly replicated. This had 60 pounds of actual nitrogen applied at green up. Looks significantly better than the 101 untreated on the left-hand side. 103 had 100 pounds of spring applied nitrogen. Looks better than the 60. So as we increase the nitrogen rates, we see an improvement in color, health, biomass, as you can see. And there's lots of other treatments, but that shows it pretty well in those 2 or those first 3 treatments. Further down in a different replicated block, this is different products, rates, and timings of different sulfur products. So this whole block right here is rates and timings of different sulfur products. And you can already see some visual differences between some of these sulfur products. So again, this is wheat no-tilled into corn stalks. It's a practice that takes place on the majority of the wheat acres in Kentucky. Most growers find the highest net revenue comes after corn. Often there's some residual nitrogen from the corn stalks, but there wasn't much this past year left over because of the higher yields. So we're vigilant selecting varieties that have good tolerance to fusarium. Obviously that's important after corn. And then we're vigilant applying the fusarium suppressing fungicides, Prosaro Pro, or more commonly Miravis Ace. We find it's a little bit more active on fusarium than Prosaro Pro at the flowering stage. Plenty of water, ground applied. So that's a quick summary what we're seeing today in this particular research trial. Thanks for watching.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are the Pests and Predators Podcast, RealAg Radio, and the Wheat School. From varietal advancements, protein and yield management, precision farming, and on to marketing, Real Agriculture's Wheat School is a video series that tackles every facet of the wheat growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Wheat School is made possible through Syngenta Canada, C&M Seeds, and Alberta Grains. Learn more at wheatschool.com. All right. Okay. So visual differences and some pretty impressive visual differences between those. Also, I got to tell you, Phil, that's a lot of crop residue. Like a lot.
Yeah. So
does that ever cause a problem?
So a little background on that. So 25 years ago, somewhere in there was a big transition between working the ground and no-tilling into corn stalks. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the big thing is farmers don't have a lot of labor, so they was looking to just no-till it. So there's a lot of technologies that have improved the process of no-tilling wheat into corn stalks. And it takes good disc seeders with plenty of ballast, sharp discs, and lots of other things. But the bottom line is the majority of wheat in Kentucky today is no-tilled into corn stalks, and our estate yields continue to climb. I mean, when I first came to this country in the very late 80s, the state yield of Kentucky, for example, was in the low 30s. And now the state average, looking at USDA data, is nearly always in the high 80s to low 90 range. So no-tilling into corn is a good program. It's a good rotation. From a point of view of there's some synergistic benefits to the corn and the beans in the rotation. It's the way a lot of farmers are going once they get equipped to successfully no-till into corn stalks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Brian, when you see residue like that, have you ever had residue like that in a field? Like that's a lot of biomass. That's
Yeah, on
there on the surface.
irrigation.
Yeah, I was gonna say that'd be about the only place to find it. Um, that is it is a lot, and Peter Johnson's in the chat saying here, even with no-till, um, between water, earthworms, biology, to have that much residue on the surface is kind of surprising. Is that pretty standard what you see, Phil?
Yeah, that's pretty common. Now, the big thing to add
Okay.
to that, you get into Kansas, Nebraska, and this year to an extent, I mean, we're very dry now. I bet we didn't get but half an inch of rain in March, and we're still dry. Now, we're supposed to get a rain tonight, but we've been dry recently. I mean, crazy dry. So that's having an impact. And you move west into Kansas, Nebraska, it's very common to plant into those volumes of residue because they don't get a lot of
Okay.
moisture to break down residue. So I think
Okay.
it's a moisture component, Peter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so speaking of moisture, Brian, you now have some, which is pretty exciting. When we're talking about nitrogen for a spring wheat crop in very dry conditions, and certainly Lethbridge, you've been dealing with that out of the last, I don't know, 20 years, 15 of them. Anyway, I exaggerate, but it has been very dry. What are farmers, for the most part, what decisions are they struggling with under dry conditions?
Well, I think like everybody, they're trying to make a proper business decision about the balance of inputs, right? And I think the thing to keep in mind is, like, we're talking today about fertility, but that is one of an array of inputs that form a system that demands that you prioritize at a certain time and base it on your predicted environment. And so with the nitrogen thing, it's like, okay, how much am I going to how much should I actually put with my planting, and how much should I apply after, if I'm still really struggling to understand what my yield potential is. And I think the lessons we've learned here, on springwort, and to a degree even winter wheat, is like, if you're a farmer struggling to do that, or if you're not really adept at, like, a lot of split application type intensification, like, a lot of times banding everything at planting gives you sufficient yields. And even statistically, scientifically, we have a hard time many times trying to show an advantage over splits until the productivity environment is high. And
Right.
so, the reward when you intensify has got to be based on the yield you're chasing, in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And also your operation. So, a lot of guys I'll talk to, Alberta, Saskatchewan dryland farmers, they'll be like, yeah, I really, some of your results really resonate because logistically I can't make that happen. Or the next guy will say, like, I split apply 3 times. And I'm like, well, if you think that's getting you what you want in terms of net returns, because at the end of the day, this is big time business. Look what a quarter section of irrigated land around here is going for. I think it's
Yes.
2.8 to 3.2 million in southern Alberta. And besides narcotics, I don't know what you grow on there to actually pay the mortgage on that. But honestly, it's big time business. And so I think that producers got to be comfortable with what they're doing and really, really dial in and understand what is coming in terms of opportunity versus what they can afford as part of their business model.
Mm-hmm. So and we have, of course, here now we have people from New Zealand even joining, so welcome here. But we've got an Eastern audience that, for the most part, is growing a winter wheat crop that so much depends on how it winters and what it looks like in the spring, how many tillers it has, whether it's going to need that extra boost or not, or maybe it's doing too well and you kind of want to manage those tillers. And then, of course, in the spring, we're looking at a spring crop, but we're also looking at chasing protein a lot of the time. And so there is the potential for, as you said, Brian, making that business decision quite late in the year. Once you know, maybe you've got yield in the bag, but you could potentially bump that protein as well using nitrogen. And so that becomes a completely different strategy if you've got the moisture. So so maybe let's touch on that just a bit. Brian, I'll stay with you for a bit here. That what kind of results could a farmer expect? So let's say the growing season, certainly we've seen this in Saskatchewan, it definitely happens in Manitoba, and parts of Alberta, where we get that moisture. When would that later, very late, protein chasing nitrogen app go on? That is the $1 million question.
Well, first of all, you've got to meet sort of your yield demand, right? So you've got to have things dialed in, and we'll talk a little bit about a slide later on that I have that talks about a source sink thingy. But generally, what we think is like if you've met your yield sufficiently, and you go in and top dress around, once the crop's in a reproductive phase, you can take advantage of a yield thing, whether or not that's winter wheat or spring wheat.
Okay.
What we learned in some of our more recent studies is like if you put a good balance down at planting, and then you wait until you get into that reproductive phase, a lot of times that really pays off. But then we also got real cute and we tried 3 splits with some of our spring wheat, and it really backfired. It was the worst treatment that we had. And so I think part of that was because we just didn't give it enough at the beginning. And of course, I'm the last person that needs to tell this audience what can happen with weather and Mother Nature when you need to get on and get that nitrogen applied and you can't. And so now it's later and later. So I think that's sort of what happened, because you remember, we're, as researchers, we're always dealing with these sort of 3 to 5 year windows, and then trying to make an inference beyond that if we have enough site years. And I think the opposite happens with farmers, where they can sometimes forget the good years and and remember like only like the 2 tails of that normal distribution, the awesome
That's
year
right.
or the horrible year, and then manage off of that. Whereas, maybe running down the center is kind of the way to go. So that's my long convoluted answer to your question.
Do not go 3, everybody. Or at least if you're going to, make sure you get out there. So, and part of that, and Brian alluded to it, we've got a slide coming up in a little bit that talks about, when this wheat crop needs that end. But a good question from Peter, thinking back, Phil, so to that clip that we saw of those trials, the trials that go in when you're doing those different treatments, is there any end going on at seeding, and if so, how much?
So there's a really good video, if anybody would want to watch it. If you go to YouTube and just type in, it's not a sales video at all. If you type in Needham placing P in the row, there's about a 5 or 6 minute video similar to the one I presented just a few minutes ago. Just a simple video, but it talks about the different treatments within that same trial, and especially the benefits of placing MAP or any forms of phosphate in the row with the seed. They stood out crystal clear, and they often do, but last fall they stood out better than any time I've ever seen before. But there's more perhaps explanation on that video, but I'd probably route a lot of the details to that. But yeah, we don't like using a lot of full nitrogen this far south. I'm talking about how dry it is right now, but we can often get 5 or 10 inches in a rain if there's some kind of tropical storm comes through here. So there's a big environmental challenge associated with putting much N down in the fall. But we had, I think, on the high end, I believe 25 or 30 pound of N, but some of them had 0, some of them had just the nitrogen in the MAP or the MESZ, so modest amounts. But the phosphate was the clearest nutrient that showed up. And I'm the biggest or second biggest. I think Peter Johnson's the biggest poster child for phosphorus in the row. I'm probably the second biggest, but we've absolutely got to get P in the row. For those growers that are watching tonight that aren't, do some trials side by side, some replicated strips preferably, because we nearly always see yield benefits to phos in the row at seeding time.
Mm-hmm. So
Well, I think
that is certainly. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I think I was just going to add, to expand the conversation there. I see Dave Hooker's on the line, and we published a paper together talking about FHB management and the importance of uniformity of that canopy for fungicide efficacy. And he had a nice piece of work there on the importance of P in crop uniformity. So it's all these nutrients inputs, there's always multiple benefits if you do it right, and penalties if you don't. And I would just add, I totally agree with Phil on that. And it also gives you potentially something to overcome a uniformity issue as well.
Especially in no-till, especially in heavy residue no-till.
Yeah. So, but that then does. So the question here that we went back and forth on quite a bit with, we didn't have, for here in Ontario, we didn't have a lot of snow. It's been a very mild winter. And so there were a lot of farmers that were pretty keen to get that first shot of nitrogen on the winter wheat. Pete, I know, and Pete, you can correct me, but, really tried to get farmers to hold off until green up, so that the crop itself was, actively starting to metabolize again and didn't just, it just because it's early doesn't mean it's rocking and rolling just yet. So Phil, when you're timing the first application of nitrogen for those trials that you're showing us, are you going in right at green up, or when do you suggest that farmers are going in there for that first shot?
We try and time the first shot right there at green up, unless you've got lots of growth and lots of tillers. If you've got lots of growth and lots of tillers, like after poor yielding corn after a drought, if somebody added 180 or 200 pounds of nitrogen on a field of corn and it was a drought year and it made 50 or 80 or 100 bushels, you've probably got a lot of residual nitrogen carried over. And in those environments, you may not need any early nitrogen at all. So you'll delay it until maybe the jointing stage, Feek 6. So we try and look at every field differently, look at the previous crop yield. Because of the higher rainfall that we get here, deep nitrogen soil tests can be a challenge. Where Brian is, I think they're much, much, much more reliable. But we try and look at soil tests for a reference also. So, years and years ago, it was quite common for most farmers to put the same amount of nitrogen on every field, regardless of the previous crop or the previous crop yield. What we try to do now is look at each field, and probably need at some point to talk about region management, splitting fields into smaller management zones and managing those separately.
Mm-hmm. That could be another whole show. Brian, go ahead.
Well, I think the other thing that needs to come into the conversation too is where do enhanced efficiency fertilizers play the where and the when for that? Because I think certainly some of the work that we've done with both winter wheat and spring wheat justifies the input. And again, back to, I was a bit biased. I got to be honest. When we first started this, I thought the use of enhanced efficiency fertilizers would be, tough to sell, given the biological response at times is modest, because I thought the premium to be paid would be cost prohibitive. And I don't think that anymore. I think certain, you get a dual inhibitor, a urease nitrification inhibitor. If it's only costing you dollars per acre, I think that's pretty important insurance. Whereas, someone would say, oh, dark brown soil zones, you don't need it. And, I don't need it here on my farm or this and that. I mean, in the meantime, they're paying for a different input that I would categorize higher up on the snake oil chart. They have no problem paying that. So I think, we see it all the time. Where at a minimum, as researchers, I think the problem is we're demanding that some of these inputs, like an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, give a significant benefit all the time. Where I think we need to start looking at it like, if it's non-significant then does that mean that if you use it at a minimum, it's guaranteeing you that you're not losing, and it might even give you a modest improvement in terms of net returns, because that's sort of been the story
Mhm.
with both winter wheat and spring wheat. And so I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well. And somebody was asking, how much do we try and put with, either, and to Phil's point, we don't want to put too much at planting with winter wheat because it's prone to loss, which it can be. But now you bring in the context of enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and that might alter how we manage things. And so there's that. There's also, okay, so then how much do you put at planting, Peter? Somebody else was asking, and I like, unless it's liquid, which I think is a different ball game with what we're seeing in real high productivity environments. I like us to be at like 50 to 60% of our need come Feeks 4. And I'll justify that with that little fancy slide later on.
Okay.
But with
We can
liquid,
do it now, Brian. We can
what's
talk
that?
about it now. We can talk about that slide now. It is a fancy one.
Oh, you want to
Yeah.
throw that up now?
Sure. Producer Jay, if you would. The one I was oohing and awing about. Is that the one, Brian?
Well,
Go
you're
back
doing lots of
one,
oohing
I
and
think.
awing, so I don't know.
Yeah, well, I just kind of do that. It's very encouraging for my guests, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, this one, I think. And then at some point, you'll have to fill me in on the snake oil. Yeah, I think you said there
Yeah.
was like a
Yeah.
hierarchy. Okay, so we'll talk about that later. Okay, so this one though that we're oohing and awing. Okay, so where does
Okay,
this fit into this
so
conversation?
first of all, everybody, Lindsay told me I had to read every word in the
I
figure
did
text,
not,
so I'm
Brian.
going to start. So if you need to go for a break and get a beer or something, no, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding. So
come on back. Yeah, okay.
this is from a fellow I know who's a physiologist. He's quite renowned in terms of the global world of wheat, Gustavo Slafer. And he's saying, and it makes sense to me, a lot of what he's talking about in this new paper in 2023 is like, a lot of what we do when we're managing wheat, and this is why we can graze wheat early. And if you're on Twitter with some of the U.S. counterparts, they're telling guys to get off the field now, because now that crop is moving into the critical growth period, which is what that dark line is basically. And so that's basically from jointing to 10 days post anthesis. That's the critical growth period. And that is when, if you screw things up in there, you will pay a big price. And the other context to it is he's kind of got an old source strength box there in light green. But what he's saying there is you've got to get things dialed in so that when that critical growth period hits, your source strength, meaning that pool or that dugout of water, if you will, needs to be full so that everything around it can utilize it. Because if it's only half full, you're going to pay a price. And the price would be in that pink box, that source or that sink strength, which is your grain, your yield. And he's converted me. I'm a total disciple of that as well. It's like, whether it's planting times, which is what we're doing with ultra early wheat, trying to move things out of that critical growth period in terms of like, when the crop is real prone to like floret abortion and that because of high temperatures, or, your nitrogen, which, kind of goes back to my thing about having at least enough in there so that that source strength is dialed in. And then you can amend to that as needed to like meet those nutritional needs that would probably give you that protein bump following that. So that's kind of why I wanted to discuss that little slide and give a shout out to Gustavo there on what he's theorizing as sort of his alternative theory on phenology and critical growth period.
Okay, so producer Jay, if you will, leave this up on the screen. Peter Johnson has a beef that I'm going to bring to you, Phil, and to Brian, that you have referenced Feeks growth stage, Feeks 4, and aren't using the growth stages that he uses. And so he would like everyone to bend to his will.
Okay,
and
so for the record, can we just say you can't teach an old dog new tricks? So so basically Feeks 4 is Zadox 31.
Right, growth stage 31. Okay.
And if we're going to, so the critical growth period would be Zadox 31 to about 69. Are you happy now, Peter?
Yeah, it's never. Okay, but it's good. We can switch Fahrenheit and Celsius. We can do Feeks to Zadoc, so it's fine. We are bilingual. We can do this. Okay. Warren has a question. Isn't it too cold for ESN during wheat's nitrogen uptake? This is a question that often comes up about different products. Brian, I'll go to you on this one. Have you had issues with conditions with ESN not maybe making it worth it?
Well, I think you got to define the context of what's worth it, because we've done a lot of work with ESN and there's nothing like it on the market in terms of seed safety. So if you're still single shooting and you need to put a lot of nitrogen down close to the seed run, and you need to go 100% ESN, you will not find another source that gives you that kind of bang for the buck. And you can almost put all your nitrogen needs down at planting and be done. Sometimes it gets promoted, oh, well, if you side band it at 100%, and we worked on this in winter wheat, that'll give you some delayed and responses for protein. And maybe, but the fact is, the work that we did was, if you then, when seed safety is not an issue, blend it 1-to-1 with just urea, you get exactly the same results, which I think Nutrien would now agree with anyway. So I don't think I'm getting into trouble with that. Now, the other thing, and somebody else on this would know as much as me about it, is like, that's a big market, and the market for ESN was the Corn Belt in the US, as far as I'm concerned. So the way it was spec'd was with a thicker coating of polymer, because it's too expensive to have multiple, products, I guess, of different thicknesses. So yeah, our experiences up here in the Northern Great Plains is that once you take it out of the seed row and seed safety is not the context, quite often it'll release too slow.
Okay, that's fair. Phil, are you doing any of these trials with any enhanced efficiency fertilizers and adding them into the mix? Or are you
Yeah,
focused on the end timing?
so we did a lot of work with ESN many years ago. The Miles Farm Supply company that brought me to this country, we had a lot of replicated trials across many different locations, and we looked at some of the ESN very early on before it was a named product. And what we found was it did exactly what they advertised, but we didn't always like what it did. And that is kind of what Brian said. If you got a field of wheat that's thin, perhaps it was planted late, it doesn't have a lot of growth, there's a lot of residue mopping up the nitrogen, and you put ESN, just ESN, 100% ESN on that, despite putting it on early, and you get a rain to perhaps move it, let's say, it often didn't release till later on, and it wouldn't green up as fast as fields that had liquid nitrogen applied, nothing like. So we learned to offset that a little bit by perhaps, and Brian mentioned it in the banding, in the side row or in the seed row, from a point of view of just adding some straight urea. But the challenge with urea and ESN was the spreadability of those products. A lot of guys, when we started using it, a lot of growers were using spinning disc spreaders, and it's really a challenge, especially like this past month. March was one of the windiest months I think I can remember for a while. We had a lot of days when the wind was blowing 30 mile an hour or more, and some people were trying to spread dry fertilizers like light, low density urea with a spinning disc spreader, and I dread to think what some of them fields going to look like. So that's kind of a quick take on ESN. It does what they say. We've just got to be mindful of the slower release, and if you need release early in a thin stand that's small, you probably need some urea added in. But if you want a faster green up and apply it more accurately, then we recommend liquid.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, you made the point, and I think that's also true as well, though, that if it's a protein bump you might be looking for, it might have a fit there for sure.
Maybe. I mean, the thing up here you have to remember is you're paying you're paying a premium for that polymer coating. So up here, because we don't have the type of humid environments that you get in the Corn Belt, even further south where Phil is, if you risk broadcasting it, a couple things happen. One is it gets stranded up in the thatch layer and it may never see any water for hydrolysis to start. So think of the premium you just paid to go and pick prills out of your thatch layer that haven't even released anything. The other thing that we did is we did a handling study on it, because some competitors were saying that it was subject to really, breaking down too easily, that delicate polymer coating. So we ran it through all kinds of stuff, actually as part of a PhD project of mine. And the fact is, the reason you might get some release if you broadcast it, not with spinners per se, but up here using air booms, is because once it hits the deflector plates, it probably fractures that polymer coating, and so now you're getting basically the results that you would with urea anyway. So if you want to chase protein, probably top dress, and if you want to do that, then I would suggest that some of the other enhanced efficiency fertilizers are better. Well, they're far better than ESN at that.
It really is. And so, and Edgar points out, how often is ESN applied in a broadcast? We're not, it isn't necessarily the most common. And to your point, Brian, it might not necessarily be the spinner spreader. And yes, it does definitely have a place. But with a lot of these nitrogen products, it's figuring out the highest risk of loss that you're trying to manage for, and then matching the right product. Okay, we're very quickly going to get to our last read of the night, because we have started talking about protein in the chat, and that is what I want to talk about next. So producer Jay, if you would, let's go to our second read of the night. Our sponsors for The Agronomists are RealAg Radio, The Wheat School, and the Pest and Predators podcast. This podcast series is where top entomologists highlight the insect field heroes hard at work for Canadian farmers. Hosted by Real Agriculture Sean Haney and brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation, Pest and Predators is an in-depth look at many of the insects who share our fields. Find out more on Real Agriculture, download the podcast, or visit fieldheroes.ca. Now, I want to be mindful of time, but I will have everyone know that I did actually pull a clip from 2017 with a very young Peter Johnson talking about topping up wheat to get a protein premium. Now, this is not necessarily, so head over to YouTube, everybody. Go find it. It's well worth the watch. But I mean, the question of a protein bump for the East, usually not the goal. These are wheats that have lower protein, and for end use, protein is not the goal. So Phil, I'll start with you first on the where protein isn't necessarily the goal. So when we are splitting our nitrogen, we really are pushing for yield. So does that completely negate a post-anthesis nitrogen application, or is it still something that does get used at times?
So most of the time, hard wheat, winter wheat, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma region and south, those areas, in addition to the spring wheat regions further north, they obviously want protein. You get paid for protein or discounted without protein. In the soft red winter wheat belt that we're in on the eastern side of the U.S. and perhaps up into Ontario for the most part, they don't want premium. So we're primarily targeting the nitrogen for yield. We want a clean, healthy flag leaf that's dark green as a excellent sink for sunlight. So we're looking for a healthy plant, but we wouldn't be looking for protein here. There are examples where millers actually want lower protein, so we wouldn't be putting on a post-anthesis for protein in soft red winter wheat, but we would obviously in hard wheat.
Mm-hmm. I can't believe, so my prairie is showing, and Brian, so we can commiserate on this one, but to me, they're talking, 9-10%. Anything over 10.7, Mark says, and the mill in Montreal will reject it. And I'm thinking 10.7 wouldn't even be worth getting out of bed in the spring wheat if it's so. But in some years, the best wheat you'd have would be 13.5 or 14 if there wasn't a lot of high protein wheat out there. So, Brian, how does the protein question change in our spring wheat crop in Western Canada?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the year. Like, it's kind of like malt barley, where if there's a lot of volume, then they start to get a bit more pickier about what they'll take. But the reality is, like, yeah, winter wheat is something that, in fact, the wheat board before its demise, I think, even lowered the minimum standard from 11.5 to 11% because it was so hard to reach with Western Canadian winter wheat. But the fact is, sometimes in southern Alberta, even winter wheat will push high in terms of protein because of some of the quality varieties that we have and management, weather, blah blah blah. And what do they do? The grain companies will blend that high protein winter wheat with low protein spring wheat if that's what's happened that year, because the spec is the protein. It's not like the guy's going to know, 30% is winter wheat and 70% is spring wheat, particularly now with no KVD or anything.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think I think protein's probably, to my point about a business decision, even more so because, okay, so with spring wheat, for example, I'm not sure what it is now. I might be dating myself here, but I know like 10 cents per point zero whatever per bushel. I think, certainly it takes some management to make sure you're in and meeting everything you need to meet to get into the minimum number one CWRS, blah, blah, blah. But beyond that, what it would take to keep going in the increments that are worth 10% or 10%, 10 cents. I mean, I think that takes a little bit of pause to think, okay, what am I doing here? Why am I chasing this? Especially, on the winter wheat side, all of the winter wheat growers, because it's coming off early too, can turn around and sell it to a feedlot if they want, right?
Yeah.
So, because it's the only grain that's coming available, unless they're importing corn and barley or whatever from the US or elsewhere. So that's why winter wheat, which is, I still don't understand why we're at such a chicken and egg thing with it, and such volatile acreage that it can never stabilize over 1 million acres around the prairies, given its dual markets. But on the spring wheat side, yeah, it's a little bit different of a ball game where it's like, okay, how much do I really want to chase the protein if I'm already over 13 and a half, maybe 14, and I got the yield I wanted.
So, and Phil, you made the point, we were talking about this before we went live, that, the spring wheat crop, especially for Western Canada, by the time it is being harvested, or sorry, by the time you'd be making that call, you might have an early indication of what the protein spreads might be, and early enough in the season, you might be able to impact it. So, so walk us through that, Phil, as far as timing goes. And I think, was it Jason said PAN, post-anthesis nitrogen. When does that go on to actually impact protein?
So a little background on the protein thing. So the growers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, Manitoba have the luxury of looking at protein levels in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. There used to be 9.5 million acres of wheat in Kansas. I think it's down to 7 or 8 million harvested, but there's a lot of wheat raised in Kansas, as everybody knows. But if the average proteins are low in Kansas, for whatever reason, it's generally the yield component. So if Kansas gets moisture and the yield is over and above what they fertilized for with nitrogen, then generally the protein is lower. We know that. We've seen that many times. So if Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Texas has low proteins generally, then the guys in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba can react by putting on some late nitrogen. What we recommend is using liquid urea, 18, 20, 21% liquid urea. That'll go on at ideally post-anthesis, sprayed on flat fan nozzles. And we've seen 10 to 15 gallons of liquid urea, again, 20, 21% nitrogen approximately, tends to get you 0.5 to 0.75% protein in 75 to 90 bushel wheat. And that assumes average management. Now, if somebody's front loading their wheat with more nitrogen, you wouldn't probably need that much. But in an average system with those yields, that's about what we've seen. But again, you need to use liquid urea. I know some people in the past have talked about using 28, 30, or 32%, just UAN. We strongly discourage that. You get too much leaf burn, too much leaf injury. it's not a product we recommend at all. Liquid urea is more money, but you rarely get any phyto out of the product at all, okay?
Brian, do you agree, or are you seeing different results?
Well, I think what we've been doing with a lot of our winter wheat work is going in with streamer jet nozzles with 2800 stabilized with Agritane. What is it? Agritane. I'm not here. I go advertising for Coke. Maybe I'll get something out of it. Agritane Plus or Ultra, and that one there, where that was a study where we were going very little at planting and then just hitting it with UAN in the spring, and the protein and the yields, they were up there. That was a good way to go. I don't see too much of the flat fans happening around here anymore, because you want to wash it all down to the roots anyway. That's where the uptake's going to be. So some of these nice, and guys have even evolved beyond streamer jets, I know, to like dribble band, this and that or whatever. But that to me has worked really well for us. But I think you got to stabilize it, though, to be honest.
I probably just need to clarify something, Lindsay, just to make sure we're 100% clear on that. So if we're dribble banding nitrogen at the jointing stage, which is Feek 6 or 31 for Mr. Johnson, we are dribbling that liquid UAN 20, 28, 32 on. We're preferably using the stream bars that deliver the vertical streams. So we want to stream nitrogen on at that stage. We absolutely wouldn't want to flat fan it on there. This year, as windy as it's been for us, lots of 30-mile-an-hour windy days, I couldn't imagine how bad nitrogen would fry wheat leaves if it was sprayed on top of wheat. Don't do it with flat fans. But again, when we're putting on the liquid urea, that's when we recommend the flat fans to spray the liquid urea onto the leaves, because we're seeing some leaf uptake through the leaves, and it wouldn't need to be washed into the root profile, especially in a dry climate, okay?
Peter wants to know, Brian, when you're talking about it, is that post anthesis or is that prior? Is that earlier for a split app?
That may have been a little bit earlier, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. And we were targeting like around 30 pounds and it was all liquid. It was 30 at planting, and then the balance at two different splits or one different split. But yeah, no, I know some guys are trying. I'm surprised to hear about the flat fan thing, to be honest. I'm not disputing that at all. I'm just surprised that works at such a late stage.
And that's something that's been used over in Europe for probably longer than I've been alive, so it's pretty well proven. Okay, but yeah, it's again, I don't want to hear any. I don't want to. I want to be really clear, but we're absolutely using liquid urea and not 28 or 32, because every now and again you hear somebody wanting to use 32 on an emerge flag leaf, and it will fry it. Okay.
Jim comments, we don't use liquid urea enough in Ontario. Is it an untapped opportunity to make yields? It's a good question. I'm not saying either of you have to answer it. I think we put it out into the ether and see who comes around. Edgar also wants to know, and so this is a good question. What does protein do in the final product? Because so Edgar's question is adding that nitrogen, which boosts the protein, because we know that protein is a high amount of nitrogen, it's needed. Does it actually change the quality, or does that added nitrogen, is it simply that they measure the protein and it's a measurement? So what does protein do? I know neither of you are bread makers, but what is protein's role in final products? What do we need to know?
From my perspective, and I'd want to talk to a miller to confirm this, but I think the protein is, well, for a start, protein is laid down last in the partitioning of the grain. So if there's adequate N left over and available for protein, then it makes protein at the very end. But from the milling and baking perspective, I think the protein level influences how far a bread product, like a loaf of bread, actually rises and fills a bag to put it in. But again, I'd be open for a more technical explanation from a miller.
Or we could get Siggy on here and they could do a whole big
Yeah.
discussion about end uses. Yeah. It is interesting though. I mean, and to Edgar's point, I mean, there's a reason that, a winter wheat or a soft wheat has a different end use than a hard red spring wheat and these sorts of things. And that certain things are crackers and cakes and other things are for bread and other things. So there is distinctly different end uses for some of these. But as Brian alludes to, sometimes they just blend it all to what they needed anyway, and the final flour is really what matters, not necessarily
Yeah,
each
they need a
individual.
certain percentage to get there
Yeah,
to meet the quality specs that they have, and glutenins and everything else affected
yeah,
by protein levels and ultimately low volume,
yeah,
um, and
yeah,
extensographs and all that kind of stuff. It
yeah.
it depends on a proper protein profile. Um,
Right,
I maybe I think part of Edgar's point was like, how much am I getting as a farmer for that? And the answer
right.
is
Yeah.
very little.
Very little. And Edgar did point out anything over 13.5% trying to chase that. It's like, I mean, it's the law of diminishing returns,
Yeah.
right? It's the same thing as once you figure out, adding another pound of N might get you a little more yield, but does it actually get you more profit? Probably not. So chasing past 13.5, rarely worth it. More than likely, seeing as you're just not going to get paid for it. So why would you realistically? And it's a very good point. Also, though, Brian, shout out for mentioning KVD. Does everybody remember kernel visual distinguishability? Are we glad we don't have to do that anymore? Anyway, there you go. That was used to.
I
I
was
thought it
wondering
was
how
very
many people
cool.
were going to pick up on that acronym. I'm glad
KVD.
that you
Yeah,
did, Lindsay.
exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, anyone in Ontario is like, what are they talking about? There you go. Ellen has entered the chat. Thank you, Ellen. Jumping on the hard wheat and soft wheat have quite different quality and use parameters. Exactly that. Ellen would be someone who could probably join us on this show and talk about all of that. So if anyone's got any
Oh yeah,
questions,
Ellen would know.
yeah, Ellen would absolutely know. So thank you for hopping in here. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left, so I do want to tackle on a few things. So I mean, we've hit on certainly working in some of the enhanced efficiency products. One thing we haven't really touched on, so Phil, if we can, and I think, I mean, it in some ways goes without saying that part of splitting the nitrogen application does mean we can potentially make the best use of a good profit or productivity potential is the word I'm trying to get out. And it does manage some of our risk potentially for loss. How much does that come into that equation though, Phil, when you're going in? So if you're going to go in for that early shot, if it requires it, as you said, if you've got tons of tillers and tons of early growth, you may not necessarily need that. If you had a lot of background N, um, how much then does the yield potential inform that second application of and what rate you're going to go in at?
I'd probably answer that best by using a drier region, and we're going to say Western North Dakota or Southern Saskatchewan, Southern Alberta. Let me answer that question for that region, then I'll circle back to higher rainfall areas. So if you look at low rainfall areas, I mean areas that get 8, 10, 12, 14 inches of annual rainfall, my suggested approach for those areas from a point of view of nitrogen management and rates would be to put a modest amount down. Brian nailed it, I think, a few minutes ago. He was talking about putting 30 or 40 pound of N down at seeding time. I'm good with that. Maybe up to 50 pounds at seeding time. I'm good to that if you've got appropriate separation. And if you start getting rainfall which elevates your potential significantly over and above what you fertilized for early on, then that's your opportunity to go in there and split apply more nitrogen, progressively more nitrogen as the rainfall comes and the potential looks higher. If it's a dry year, you're in Lethbridge, you've got very little moisture early on, you may not need much more nitrogen than the 50 you put down at seeding time. So that would be an answer, I would say, for the drier regions. The principles would be similar in Kentucky and most of the eastern US. From a point of view of the big benefit to us is we don't know the health of the crop and the yields of the crop, the yield potential, and the appearance of a crop can change between different regions of a field, different soil types, different topographies. So being able to look at that crop at Feek 6 or a Z31, Peter, we have a much better idea to look at that field and look how green it is. And this year was a very good example of that, being as dry as it's been. We know which fields need more nitrogen because they're greener, which fields need less nitrogen. You can look at fields and make a much better decision on how much nitrogen is required at fix 6 or Z31 than you can putting it on early. So we're doing a better job from a stewardship perspective by splitting nitrogen. That's my take on that. Okay.
So Pete has a question, and I'm going to modify it for Brian, but I'll ask it of you first, Phil. So in that situation, you've got a good-looking crop. Do you have a rule of thumb of how many extra pounds per inch of rainfall? That sounds like a very tall order, Peter Johnson. But if Phil has it, goodness.
Yeah, that's a hard
Political
one
stuff.
to answer. That's a research
Right?
dissertation.
That's perfect.
I mean, we've had years here, Peter, where I think 1 year in Yen, 2 or 3 years ago, I think we had 14 inches of rain, I think in April, which is bizarre. That's probably more rain than Brian gets in a year at Lethbridge, right? Is that right?
Several. 2 years?
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we get 14 inches of rainfall as a result of a tropical storm that just dumps and dumps and dumps rainfall, a significant portion of your nitrogen is gone, and you need to come back and put more nitrogen on. Now, this year's the other extreme. I don't think we had more than a half of an inch in March total, and I'm not sure we had a half inch. Some areas I don't think got that much. So two completely different sets of conditions. If you're talking about Lethbridge or southern Saskatchewan, you need the rainfall to generate the potential, then you need to put more nitrogen on to feed it. If you're talking about unusually high rainfall events in Kentucky or the southern states, then you can lose a significant portion of your nitrogen to leaching or denitrification, especially if it's warmer.
Mm-hmm. See, Brian, by not having any water, you save so much money in nitrogen.
Yeah. Well, to Phil's point, I mean,
yeah.
one of the original CWS trials we worked on, I mean, I like being a little more closer to 50-60 at planting, and I think to Phil's point, sometimes that's all you need. There's a slide there that we had on in response to rates, because I know some guys are saying that they're getting CWS responses at or beyond 180 kilograms of N per hectare. I'm not so sure about that, because right here in sunny southern Alberta on sandy soil, there's been years where 60 pounds suffices for yield, and a little bit more sort of pushes the protein up a little. And then you can go back to Phil's thing where, okay, depending on the almanac or whatever your thing is, like, what can I rely on, and how do I make my predictions and decide how much more should I apply after that, and go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, and that is the, I mean, one of the powerful tools we have with splitting a nitrogen application is that there is that opportunity to potentially go in. But Brian, and especially as you show in that beautiful slide, that there still needs to be that critical amount on early, just because wheat is one of those crops that sets that yield potential so early in the season. We really cannot short it in that critical period. So absolutely important. Okay, we have to wrap this up, although I don't want to. This has been so much fun, and some great questions and great comments from everybody following along as well. And there's, of course, so much more to cover on this topic. Very quickly, if you do have an off-calf project that you need a KSE for, tonight's episode does qualify. You can, here, where's my fingers? There we go. Email Margaret May, may@ontariosoilcrop.org. She will get you sorted out. You'll need your project number and all of those sorts of good things. Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Brian, for joining me here on The Agronomist. I do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Enjoyed it, Lindsay. Good as always.
Alrighty. Okay. And so, of course, we'll be back next week we don't have a break until the May long weekend. So every Monday, I know that we're heading into the busy planting and seeding season, but if you can, join us Monday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern. Next week, we're going to be talking soybean cyst nematode and other creepy crawly things in the soil with the brothers Tenuta. So we have a Manitoba Tenuta and we have an Ontario Tenuta, and they'll be joining us. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you for all your questions and your comments. We'll see you next week. Cheers, everybody.